story, on a recent field trip, we had a student exclaim, "This place is better than the Grand Canyon." So, I'll let you be the judge after our talk today. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Scott Thybony has traveled throughout North America on assignments for major magazines, including National Geographic, Smithsonian, and Outside. He wrote a cover story on the Grand Canyon for Men's Journal and a piece on canyon exploration for National Geographic magazine, which was translated into a dozen languages. Several of his books have focused on the national park, and Canyon Country sold hundreds of thousands of copies. The Wilderness Society chose Scott as voice of the land for Grand Canyon, and his commentaries are regularly heard on public radio. Twice, the National Geographic Society has awarded him grants for Grand Canyon explorations. His first job below the rim was washing dishes at Phantom Ranch, followed by work as a river guide on the Colorado. Since then, the pay has improved, but the view has not. Here to present Grand Canyon Archaic and exploration, please help me welcome Scott Thybony.
Okay. You guys all made it midday in the middle of the week to this talk on a spectacular place I'm sure all of you know well. But I'm going to be focusing on the Archaic rock art. It dates back thousands of years. And there's a remote area of the western Grand Canyon where most of these sites are found. And it, because of the vast isolation out there and the vertical terrain, it's preserved this visual record dating back thousands of years. And it gives you a little glimpse into the probably more of the spiritual lives of these people than their everyday, mundane living as hunters and gatherers out there. This opening photograph here shows a landmark out there called the Dome. And I've seen it from all different sides, and I've never seen the Dome yet, so I don't know why they call it that. As you know, with place names, they don't always follow reason and logic. But it rises up from this esplanade platform, which is a bench that is prominent in the western Grand Canyon. And it's located about a third of the way below the rim, maybe a little more. But in the west there, essentially you have a canyon countersunk into another canyon. It's almost like a canyon within a canyon. And that bench there tends to be broad in some places and narrows down very tightly in others. The Supai Formation forms the cap rock. It's more weather resistant and than the Hermit Shale above it. And it also is the upper member of it, what they call the esplanade member, has a series of, there's about 3 little micro levels there that have overhangs. And in some of those, you find this this visual record of the Archaic. And most of these sites, or I could say all these sites, essentially were unknown until the 1980s. So it's only been fairly recently that this type of rock art site has given us a glimpse, a look into that practically lost world of the Archaic. This is the most well-known of the Archaic rock art sites. It's called Shaman's Gallery, and it's the most intensively studied. And these rock art sites, there's probably only 4, these days maybe 5 dozen, and only 4, 5, 6 of those are major sites. And they're scattered, most of them lie hidden where they're hard to see. Shaman's Gallery tends to be more out in the open, like later rock art panels, Basket Maker, Ancestral Puebloan. those tend to be almost have a billboard effect where they're out made to be seen. Most of these from the Archaic, the very old ones, are tucked away. And to find them, you have to search. And it's rugged, complex terrain, real time consuming. And I'll later go into one of the searches we did over a 5-week period, attempting to locate these sites on a National Geographic project. The style of rock art is I tend to use the word otherworldly, but it's otherworldly for me, but for the people that made it, it's their world. It's what they would have experienced. And the major sites that characterize this style, most of the images are polychrome, multicolored. The smaller sites, a lot of those tend to be just single colors, black, red, white, or sometimes 1 or 2 colors. But the major sites tend to be multicolored, and you have images overlying each other, and it gives a real, when you sit there and look at these, your eye tends to get tired after a time, and it sort of releases its focus, and it allows these underlying images, it gives you the sensation that they're surfacing to the top, and there's almost like a circulation of images. That may not have been intended, but that's the effect it has on people these days. A lot of the figures are what they call anthropomorphs, human-like, and they're long body, and they could represent supernatural beings, ancestral spirits, or even humans that are in the process of transforming from one state of being to another. And these sites tend to have a very ritualistic feel to them, which I know isn't a very scientific way of looking at them, but they're probably used for rituals in this hunting, this gathering culture. And how they use them, we don't know. They also tend to, especially ones like the Shaman's Gallery, they tend to reflect almost a trance state, an alternate state of mind, put it that way, and possibly induced by fasting or thirst or rhythmic drumming and dance, and even psychoactive plants. There are other rock art sites in West Texas, Pecos River style, which is very similar to these. And in those sites, they have found depicted, datura and peyote, and found remnants of those plants in the cave shelters where the rock art occurs. But those haven't been found in the Grand Canyon, but it's likely, at least the datura would have been used at times and for purposes we just don't know. A lot of people speculate, but I try to back away from the speculation as much as possible, but I'll slip into it as you'll see. This is a site, a panel known as the red deer. It's a naturalistic deer, which usually you have these hallucinatory type images often, but the naturalistic animals tend to be very small. This one is about 22 inches long, so it's very unusual. I thought I'd lead off here, though, by using this image to play off of, as I tell you a story, a Hopi story that was related to me by a traditional leader from First Mesa. Now, the reason I want to tell this, it kind of sets the mood. It gives you kind of the mood of that archaic mindset. The Hopis, of course, are as far away from the Archaic period. In the Grand Canyon, that would have gone from about 9,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago, maybe 2,000. The rock art images, I've never been able to date those directly, but there's related styles that date from about 3,500 years old to about 5,000 years old. So that's probably the time period we're looking into. So this Hopi story has as much, the Hopis are as far away from the Archaic chronologically as we are, But the way they think about and relate to the natural world tends to be closer to those archaic times, than our present culture. When this Hopi leader, he was at the time a tribal judge by the name of Delford Leslie, and over the years he's become a close friend, and he said there's a story he'd been wanting to tell me, and he gave me permission to tell others, but he also gave a warning. He says, the people you tell this to are not going to believe it, but it happened. And this took place, the story has the feel of a legend recorded by ethnographers back in like the 1880s. But this incident occurred in the 1960s. And there's a group of Hopis that went to hunt in one of their traditional areas south of the South Rim. It was outside the park in the National Forest. It's a place called Skinner Ridge, which is still used by the Hopis. And there's a group of those, of the Hopi from First Mesa, left their offerings at the shrine to a deity called the Child Sticks Out Woman at the foot of First Mesa. And they made their way to their hunting area. And while they're there, they spent several days there, and there's a close friend of the tribal judge. And in the 60s, he would have been about 12 years old, but this friend of his was the leader of their pack of boys at Walpi. And he'd gone off on this hunt. And then at night, he stepped away from the campfire. And this site is up in the deep Ponderosa pine forest, with deep shadows. And he walked away from the campfire and got lost. He got turned around. And he got desperate to find his way back and searched and just was disoriented, couldn't find his way. And he sat down to try to collect his thoughts. And as he was sitting there, he sensed the presence of something behind him, and it scared him. And he couldn't move for a period of time. But he finally worked up his nerve, and he looked behind him, and there was a huge deer there with the great spreading antlers. And this deer spoke to him in Hopi. He says, "Don't be afraid, I'm your uncle." And his uncle had passed away 2 years before. He says, "Come with me, climb on my back, and close your eyes, and hold on." So this lost hunter climbed on the deer, and he began to ride through the forest. And he described it as he could feel the bounding motion of the deer, and he could feel the branches sweep past him. And it was a long ride. It kept going. And finally, even with his eyes closed, he could tell they were descending down a long trail down into the Grand Canyon. And from the location of Skinner Ridge, that trail was probably the Tanner Trail, off in the eastern part of the main South Rim area. But they rode down this trail and finally got to the bottom of the canyon. And the deer told him he could open his eyes. And there was an immense kiva, and they were invited inside the kiva. And inside the kiva were all of the people who had died in the canyon or had gone missing, disappeared. And they were the deer people. They had become the deer people. And they were, some of those people were in their deer forms, and others were transforming into their human shapes. And so they said, because you have entered the kiva now, you are one of us. And we'll have to teach you the ritual of becoming a deer, which they did. And so once he had learned it, then the deer took him back to his camp and let him go in some distance from camp. And he walked in there, and his Hopi friends told him that there had been an intensive search. Even in the 1960s, they had a helicopter out searching for him. And he was sworn to secrecy, so he couldn't tell the other hunters what had happened to him. But the tribal judge telling me story says when he came back, he was a changed man. He was able to heal. In the past he hadn't, but he was able to heal people. And he had an amazing ability to fix things. Out of nothing he could make something. And he He also, which, was the most scary for this 12-year-old, is that he could look at you and read your thoughts, tell you what you were thinking. And that kind of rattled Telford, so he again didn't tell anybody at this point what had happened. But he would periodically go back to the Grand Canyon and assume his deer form, and then he'd travel back to Hopi. So it was back and forth for a period of time until he went back in the fall of the year and was shot by a hunter in his deer form. And because of that, he knew he was going to die as a human. So he went right back to the mesas, to his village, and he sat down with his mother to tell her what had happened when he got lost and everything that had happened since then. He said, now, because I've died as a deer, I will have to suffer the fate of a deer and die in my human form. And later, I'm not sure the length of time, but there was an incident up at Walpi on the mesas, and there's a man who had been drinking heavily, and he had a rifle, and he was holed up in one of the little rooms, little houses up on the top of the mesa. And the Hopi police had just set up a perimeter, and they're going to wait him out. But this friend of Telford's, the lost hunter, scolds him. He says, it's your duty to protect the women and children. You need to disarm this man. So he walked in there, and they heard one shot. And so he was killed in his human form. So that idea of hunters forming this close bond, there's almost this kinship with the animals they hunt. You can see that in the rock art from the Archaic times. But those traditions still maintain, and at least a remnant of those has made its way into contemporary cultures in our backyard. This is a section of the Shaman's Gallery that I showed earlier. But this one has been digitally restored. There is a man named Bill Ott, and he was a river ranger up on the Green River in Utah for a while. Then he worked as a river guide in the canyon off and on. And he lived in Flagstaff, and he finally decided, okay, he was going to live off the grid. He had enough of civilization. He's going to pull the Walden Pond. And so he sold and gave away all of his possessions except for what he could carry on a $250 motorcycle. And then he drove up to Cave Junction, Oregon, and he had a piece of land he had bought. And so he built a cabin using hand tools and cut all of his firewood with hand tools. Living the Thoreau life up there. But about once a year, though, he'd come back to Arizona, and he still had friends on the river, so he'd take a river trip through Grand Canyon. And on one of those trips, his friend took him up a long marathon hike from the river up to the Shaman's Gallery, and just blew him away. He'd never seen anything like that in the canyon. Even though he was one of the most experienced backcountry hikers, probably among the top 12. He was the first to do a through hike, a solo hike on the north side of the river from Lee's Ferry to Grand Wash Cliffs, taking 78 days. He did most of that on his own. A few food caches. When he got to Kanab Creek, Kanab Canyon, he hiked all the way up to Kanab to resupply, and then back to continue his hike. So he's very comfortable, very knowledgeable with the canyon, but was unfamiliar with the rock art. So after that trip, he had heard that I spent time on various projects and knew the locations of some of the key sites. And he stopped by my office to talk, and just really enthusiastic. And he at that time didn't even have a camera, but he had no intentions of publishing. He didn't post anything online. He wanted to know the location of these sites just for his own interest. So I knew he would be probably more secretive than I am. So I gave him a location of at least half dozen of the key sites. So we went and explored those, and then next year he came back after another river trip. He said, okay, what areas have you explored? So I marked out on the map, showed him areas we'd explored. He says the reason he wanted to know is because he decided to undertake a project, an ambitious project. He got very curious of how these rock art panels might have looked when they were first painted, 3,000 years ago. And so he decided to photograph these and then to digitally restore them. Okay, this is a guy that didn't even have power tools, so he had to buy himself, he bought a good camera, learned how to use it, and then he bought a laptop, a decent laptop. So he started taking photos of the rock art, and he worked up in Oregon as a home care nurse. And a lot of his patients were elderly and slept most of the time. So he would sometimes have 8 hours in a day, and he'd get on his laptop, and he would go pixel by pixel and try to restore these images the way they were. Ones that have been covered by smoke stains or spalls. The minor spalls, when he had a 90-95% certainty of what color had been there, he would correct those. But if it was a large spall, he would just leave it blank. So he was very careful to try to get these as accurate as possible. Okay, so he'd work on a panel, and then he'd make prints, and then he'd correct himself. He would look at it very carefully and say, oh, I got that a little wrong, that's not a bighorn, that's a deer, He'd go back and forth. Oh, one thing to point out, before he started doing this, the work you see here, he stopped by my office after another river trip, and he showed me his early attempts, and they were pathetic, I didn't think he was going to be able to pull it off at all, and he stayed with it. He was determined, just like he was determined on these long hikes, one step after another, just that long grind to do a hike of, 78 days. Some people take much longer to do that hike through the canyon. The only person that hiked the length of the canyon before him was Kenton Grua, who had hiked on the south side, another river guide. In this talk, I'm pointing out the number of river guides that did some of the early exploration and finding of these sites. They haven't been given credit in the literature for, especially Mary Allen, I'll talk about that. She was the one who actually began the investigations of what she called the Grand Canyon polychrome. It's also known as the Esplanade style of rock art. You can see up in the left-hand corner how the rock art looked before he began to restore it, and then the job he did below. These images of his I'm showing you, I didn't see them before he disappeared. It was only during the search and we were on his computer and trying to find clues that I found, we found these, these images that he'd been working on, and just were, I thought they were spectacular. Okay, there's Bill as a river guide in the right-hand corner. Then later in later years, as he began to research the rock art. Okay, 2012, in the spring of 2012, the last time Bill stopped by to talk, he wanted to know where, he'd asked me, first of all, where the major sites were. Then he wanted to know where we had searched. The last time he wanted to know where we haven't searched. And I said, well, across the river, as far as I know, nobody's done a extensive search. But I doubted there would be any of the Grand Canyon polychrome because, first of all, it's on the Wallaby Reservation, and they've essentially closed it down. They don't issue hiking permits there except in very rare circumstances. And they, before the closures though, a couple friends had hiked through there. and had never seen any of this archaic style of rock art. So I told Bill that it's unlikely there would be any over there. Because of the closure, he knew he wouldn't be able to get a permit. So a couple of years after I talked to him, he went in there without a permit. He had a friend drop him off. His plan was to spend 3 weeks. He would go down Mohawk Canyon and then do a loop up National Canyon, search out all the probable areas, and slip in there under the radar, and try not to get busted by the walleye. Well, he was overdue about 10 days when his friend who dropped him off contacted the Coconino County Search and Rescue Team. His friend waited 10 days because the year before he had been hiking on the north side of the river, and he was a week overdue. He had injured himself and but managed to make his way out. So his friend thought, okay, something came up. He's experienced. He knows what he's doing. He's been slowed up, delayed, but he'll make it through. But after 10 days, the search and rescue came in, conducted a intensive search for 5 days initially, and then they extended it 2 more days. Aerial searches, horses, quads in the rim. The walleyes helped out somewhat on horseback searches down in Mohawk Canyon. Some of you might know Michael Gillieri there. He's the co-author of the book, The Death in the Grand Canyon, with Tom Myers, which still comes out with new updates just about every couple of years. We did a thorough search in there. There were a few tracks that showed up on the bed of Mohawk Canyon. And it was a dry spring, but Bill was experienced. He would have, the water pockets in Esplanade were dry, but he would have known where to find water. And so he was down in the bed of the canyon. There was a big water pocket down there. There's even some springs up higher up in the canyon. So I don't think water was a problem. He's still missing since 2012. No serious clues have ever turned up, and a very intensive search. And I got involved with the search because I knew Bill and I knew where he was going to be looking for that style of rock art. So I told the searchers, okay, focus on these areas as the most probable areas he would have looked in. But he disappeared, and as far as I know, he's the only rock art researcher who's disappeared in action.
Were there any recent deer kills that they saw?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a new rock art panel of a red deer. Well, I hope you told that story. The reason you wanted to tell it was to give me some comfort, because my brother had died in the canyon. So I thought that this might add a little depth to that, what I had experienced there. Okay, 10 months after the initial experience, Glenn Rink, a field botanist, former river guide, was a good friend of Bill Ott's, and he didn't think that the search had been intensive enough in National Canyon. So the head of the search and rescue took him 2 trips to the tribal council to get permission for the 2 of us to go back in there on a 5-day search 10 months later. And yeah, we saw I don't think he ever got over into National Canyon, which is to the east of Mohawk. He may have gone downriver a little bit, but it's most likely what happened is he's in his early 60s. He was starting to have some health problems, still super fit, but he may have had a medical issue. He could have had an accident like he had the year before. He got injured. He crawled in underneath a low overhang, dragged his pack in, and then died there. Couldn't make it back out to water for some reason. And then the aerial search and even a search on the ground would have been very hard to find unless you happen to get super lucky and bump into it. This style of rock art here is another style of archaic rock art called Tusayan used to be called Tusayan Red. You find them on the south rim, and there's only one other site that I know down in the canyon that's along the Bright Angel Trail. And this pretty extensive panel in National Canyon is the farthest west that style has occurred. Okay, this is Shaman's Gallery again, unrestored, just the way it looks when you hike in there today. Again, it's the best known of these rock art panels, the most studied. It wasn't until the 1980s, though, that word of it began to get out to the wider world. Mary Ellen, who became a friend, she's a close friend of Tony Williams, a good friend of ours, and she had always had an interest in the past, the prehistory. And the day after graduating from high school, she took a Greyhound bus to the Arizona Strip, and she started working with an archaeologist named Doc Thompson on digs out in Tweed Valley in that area. And she got to know John Riffey, the long-time ranger out there, he spent 40 years out there with his wife Mary. And Mary Allen got involved with Mary's bird studies, and she first came upon this Grand Canyon polychrome style in those early days. And John Riffey, from one of the ranchers, had heard about this rock art site, and he never had hiked in there. But he passed the word on to Mary, so in 1981, she was the first kind of on record to see this site, and it just blew her away. And she decided to make it her project to record, try to find more of these sites. So she would ask everybody she knew who got out in that country, and BLM rangers or archaeologists and Forest Service. Not so much Park Service, because they were off at the South Rim, and she was more in the western part of the canyon. But she began in 1984, gave her first presentation at a rock art conference on what she called the Grand Canyon polychrome style. And she focused on this site here. She called it Spirit Shelter. It later got renamed by Polly Shasmer. Yeah, Mary worked as a river guide for 20 years, and she did a rock art research in between river trips. That in 1986, she did her first published article on the rock art, and it was in that year that this Gordon Smith, a mule wrangler there, made his discovery of the Shaman's Gallery. He had worked at the North Rim as a mule wrangler, but he got fired when he got into a fist fight at the Rough Rider Saloon. And so he fired him, and the line of work, his father decided that he had to do something, so his father would drop him off in remote areas of the North Rim in the National Forest, and he would set up traps. So he did a lot of exploring, and he had a real interest in the past, and he marked down all the prehistoric sites he found. And on one of his little hikes in the area, he dropped down into this canyon. He didn't even know it was the main Grand Canyon. And he came upon this Shaman's Gallery, and he said it scared him when he first saw it. He was by himself, and he said it looked like aliens, or it looked like it could be spirits, or whatever it was. He was certain they were painting what they saw. And he said he would never, he's a tough mule wrangler, he would never camp there alone by himself. Well, he took photographs of it, and he wrote the superintendent of the park. And their archaeologist wrote back, and she said, "Oh, nothing like this exists in the national park. This looks like Australian Aborigine rock art." So his credibility was on the line, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to block out some days. We'll go in there. I'll show you this stuff." So Jan Balsam and a couple of other park rangers hiked in, and he showed them the rock art site and some other interesting sites in the area. And so 4 months later, the park contracted with Polly Shasma, and Polly is the foremost authority on Southwest rock art. She wrote a book on it, and published in 1980, was really opened up to a wider audience, the whole interest in rock art. And archaeologists, up until the 80s, tended to shy away from it because it's very difficult to interpret. They just consider it just another rabbit hole that suck up all your time and not yield good solid scientific results. But Polly Shaston was the one that got that moving, and so she recorded the site. I'll show some photographs of her trip in there, guided by Gordon and some of his mule wrangler buddies. Let me show you those now. Okay, here's Polly has degrees in anthropology and history. She's also an artist. So she was contracted to record this entire, in scale, this entire rock art panel. Made these real meticulous drawings. And she was there with her husband, who is the state archaeologist of New Mexico. So they did a good, thorough job of documenting this site. Now, Polly's the one who changed it and gave the name Shaman's Gallery to Mary's irritation. But after this was published, that drew some interest into the area. The Park Service has been very protective of these sites, and the location of the Shaman's Gallery has made its way out. But a lot of these other rock art sites are still protected and still kept. The people go make the pilgrimage in there to see them tend to be very secretive, so there's not a lot of information on locations. Before I get off Gordon Smith, Gordon Smith was angry at the Park Service. I heard it through the grapevine. He was very angry at the Park Service because they didn't give him credit for his discovery of Shaman's Gallery. Mary Allen had presented papers on it and published. But so he was kind of angry at that. But he did have an argument, and the argument was that back in D.C., I was back talking to the editors at National Geographic, and they had just had a controversy because they had published an article in the main magazine about the last major waterfall discovered on the planet. And this guy contacted him and says, "Oh, I was there 2 years before your writer was in there." And he had this little grainy photograph taken with a telephoto from miles away. And Geographic has come upon this problem from the very beginning. Who gets credit for a discovery? And their rule of thumb is you not only have to find something, but you have to publicize it. So you have to give the presentation at like a major conference. Whether Mary's presentation's qualified, who knows? Publish usually in a respected journal. Somehow let the scientific community know about what you found. The Park Service didn't know about that site, and Gordon was actually the first one to inform them. So he did have a certain claim to being the discoverer. So I was asked to write a story on the Grand Canyon for Men's Journal, a magazine, and they wanted to focus on the main central part of the canyon, where 98% of the people see the canyon. But I talked them into letting me bring in some of the outlying areas. And I thought if I could get in touch with Gordon Smith, he'd be an interesting character, a colorful character to write about. And I'm not even scratching the surface of how colorful he turned out to be. But he didn't have a phone. I had no way to get in touch with him. And of course, you're always on deadlines. And so, again, through the grapevine, I'd heard that he had claimed that he had discovered Montezuma's treasure in an area not far from the Grand Canyon and up in the Mount Trumbull area outside the park. And he had hired a lawyer, and he had contacted the Bureau of Land Management, and he offered to take them to this find if they would give him 10% of what was in this cave. And of course, they legally couldn't agree to that. So he kept it quiet. He said, "I'm going to take it to my grave." I called the BLM archaeologist, and she said she had no way to get in touch with Gordon, but gave me the number for the lawyer, and the lawyer passed on my message. And so Gordon called, and he was very suspicious, very paranoid. He even thought I was a federal agent, but finally, I reassured him. He agreed to do a trip in there where he could show me the Shaman's Gallery, because I'd never been out there. I was running from assignments to assignment, and I kept hearing about these great sites that Mary and her friend Tony were finding. And it wasn't until later that I made time to get in to see some. Being on a deadline, I had to get in there, hike into the canyon, see the site, and get back out on a long 14-hour day. So Gordon agreed to do it and take me in there. And this friend of mine offered to loan me a pistol, and I said no. I said, no, just if you mistrust somebody, that tends to, they pick up on that, and they tend to mistrust you, and it's a downward cycle. It's like that novel by B. Traven, the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Is just a good example of how that paranoia feeds on itself, and in the movie they made off of that. So I figured the best way to handle this was just to be completely trusting of Gordon. And so I met him there in the dark in Fredonia, and we start driving down 50 miles of dirt road into one of the most remote corners of the Grand Canyon. First thing he tells me is that he's carrying a gun. I said, "Well, Gordon, I've done all this hiking over the years, and I've never found a need for it, And so anyway, we get talking, and I think I reassured, calm him down a little bit. We get out there to the trailhead, and I leave the keys in the ignition and just walk away from the truck, just extending trust. If he's worried about me, he could take the vehicle and just leave me out there, And instead, he goes up onto a high point. He's gone for 10 or 15 minutes. He's checking to make sure the place isn't staked out. And so anyway, we go into that Shaman's Gallery, and just this great visionary site dating back so many thousands of years, and get all these wild stories from Gordon, and I was able to work in a little bit of that into that article. So the Shaman's Gallery, being the best known, some of the hardcore river guides would occasionally take their passengers from the river. It's a long marathon day hike to reach it from the river, so it had to be a very select few that could do it. And Brad Demick, who Brad and I trained together as rookie boatmen back in 1973. Brad stayed with it, and just last year did his last commercial trip. But he makes stories, and a few years ago, he named one of his stories Shaman's Gallery, which surprised me because the tradition among dories, they name them after places that have been lost. And he says, well, the reason he did is because it's been lost to the river community. The Park Service closed down any visitation from river parties. They still allow people to hike in from the rim, but it was his favorite hike off the river. And so to record that, he named the story the Shaman's Gallery. Okay, I got involved in this after going to the Shaman's Gallery, and with my friends, they were doing these rock art exploratory trips. And so I began to make time, and usually would have maybe just 2 days or 3 days. They always rush, real push trips. But a friend of ours who now lives in Prescott, a former river guide by the name of Bob Dye, he lives here with his wife outside of town. And he was among the few, there was only a handful of river guides who did a lot of extensive exploration, backpacking in the canyon. Most of them were content to do trips, just day trips off the river. But Bob was up exploring as a volunteer for the Forest Service, and he found this great rock art panel. And so a week later, he gave us rough directions on how to find it. You know, no GPS coordinates. And it usually takes us several day back trip. I couldn't afford the time. But Mary knew about a route she thought might go just a day trip off the rim, super rugged, steep, loose. And so we were looking around for this site that Bob found when I noticed there was a pictograph on a cliff wall next to a low overhang. I called those guys over, and Tony immediately ducked underneath and started crawling back. And this was a hidden panel about 20 feet in, and the lighting back in there is just this luminous twilight lighting. And the whole back wall had this panel of, site never recorded. You know, there may have been a cowboy that had crawled in there. Certainly the Indians, even in historic time, that used the area probably knew about it, but it was another unrecorded site. This shows a wider view of the panel. There's even, when you're lying your back in there, you couldn't stand upright. You had to crawl in, but there are images on the ceiling overhead too. And what looks like a cloud there is actually a calcium deposit. But all the rest there is rock art and superimposed and overpainted rock art images. This is the site nearby that's been restored by Bill Ott, so it brings out the images a lot better. But this is the one we went in there looking for initially. And there's Mary in a site that she found as her favorite. It's a complex of panels, and most of it is archaic period. Some of it even in historic times. There's several bison that have been done in a very naturalistic style in charcoal with arrows, kind of pin cushioning and that would have been done in more historic times. There are roasters or roasting pits in the area. It was during this period that I began to get more of an interest. I was back east in DC and talking to one of the editors, and she mentioned that National Geographic had just decided to try to get back to its roots. And from the beginning, they backed, financed scientific expeditions, scientific research. But they decided they were going to start issuing grants for pure exploration. You know, and part of the requirement is that you don't do any research. It's just going out and finding stuff. And so she asked me if I knew of any place that might qualify. I said, well, yeah, come to think of it, there's an area of the Grand Canyon that I've been interested in spending more time. So they gave me one of the first of these new grants. And so for a period of 5 weeks and increments of 4 and 5 days, I would link up usually with 2 other people, sometimes just with one segment I just did on my own. But I focused on areas that had the highest probability of finding sites. And so over the course of that 5 weeks, we turned up, I always try to avoid the word discovery because you're not really discovering it. You're finding unrecorded sites that are not known to the wider world, put it that way. So yeah, we were finding some new ones, we were revisiting the old ones. And just to give you an indication of how secretive Mary was, I was a friend, and I got her recruited to come on this project, because she was the expert on this style of rock art. And so I told her what my plans were. And the first trip that I wanted to do was to explore an area that she knew that area. But she didn't tell me anything about any rock art there. And so, Mary and then John Toner, her husband at the time. The three of us were hiking down this, essentially a big orange trail that had been slightly improved by miners at one time. Lots of exposure. And we were on that trail before she admitted. She says, oh, well, since you're planning to camp down in this area, let me tell you about the places I found there. So it was this whole complex of archaic rock art panels and cowboy camps and roasting pits and quite a nice area. It's just a few shots from out there. We had 1 week there, it just rained steady, so we had no problems with water. You often have to rely on pothole water in the Esplanade. Unless you're really knowledgeable, there's a few springs there, and there's a few narrow little east-west trending canyons that tend to be in the shade, totally in the shade all the time. And in those you can often find little potholes. But it tends to dry up there, and several times I've had to cut short trips just because it was too dangerous. You know, you never want to trust your life on a water pocket because they dry up, even the best ones occasionally. You always want to carry enough water with you, so if you have to, if it's dry, you can turn back and get back to water. Okay, this is not archaic, this is a basket maker style rock art. It's known as Cave Valley style. But there's some of that on the Esplanade too, not much. Most of the sites we ran into were archaic. But what's interesting about this is on the little ledge below it, there's a mono that's used for grinding pigments. And it still has the red pigments embedded in the mono. It's just lying there below the rock art images. Is probably 1,000 years old. It just shows you how infrequently people get into these areas, especially back then. It's getting more looked at over time. I wanted to put up this too as a throw out the possibility. But there were several archaic panels that had stylized plants. And this one, I believe, represents rice grass, which in these people, that would have been a major staple. They would have had these grasslands out on the Esplanade. They would have spent at the proper time of year gathering these in burden baskets, gathering these seeds, probably storing them away for times of year when they don't have access to as much food. But these people knew the seasons, their lives depended on it. They knew the patterns of the habits of the animals and all the plants. The rice grass has a seed pod. It's almost like a thumb and a forefinger. And when it's ripe, it opens up and drops a single seed. And so that pictograph looked to me like it was representing a rice grass plant. But it shows that 2 seeds are still in place. It shows one pod is empty and the other pod is just in the process of dropping a seed. So the period of time that the rice grass seeds is about 3 weeks, some areas maybe 4 weeks. And it generally tends to be around the same time each year. It's subject, of course, to the environmental changes in environmental conditions, rainfall in particular. But an archaic person looking at that could have estimated the time within about a week. They didn't need to slice time any thinner than that for their purposes, unlike us. And so that probably was a time stamp on this rock art panel, giving the people indication of when these events took place, whatever they were indicating in the rock art. Okay, John Hurst there is a river guide, still is guiding. He guides up in Alaska and in the Grand Canyon. But he's one of these just hardcore hikers, and he's got a knack for finding stuff. He climbs all around, he checks under every little overhang, just high energy. And the photograph of him there is not in Grand Canyon, but it is a rock art site, but it's the only good shot of him I had. He discovered, he found this unrecorded site that I'm standing under here in the left-hand corner. It's known as the Hades site, and it was a pristine site. John was on a backpacking trip with a couple other friends, and he got a little ahead of them and dropped into a side canyon, went down farther than most people would have, and found this pristine site. No graffiti, no cowboy glyphs, and very little deterioration of the images themselves. Now okay, on the left is that restored panel that Bill Ott did. On the right is the way it looks unrestored. You have these long-bodied 5 figures that, when I first saw it, looks like they were in stylized dance poses. One hand up and one hand down, almost reminiscent, of course in no way connected, but reminiscent to me of like some of the stylized ancient Greek iconography. But four of them are upright, and one is upside down, being held by the foot. And what you can't see here is that in this overhang, there's a horizontal crack that goes in quite deep, about 30 feet. And these images here, these figures, are coming up, emerging out of that crack, as if they are flowing up out of the underground, the other world, the other side of the wall, however they conceptualize this spirit world. In the same overhang, there's another figure that's 9 feet long. The tallest of these is 7 feet. There's another figure 9 feet long. That's the longest of all the archaic images that I've seen. And it's like a ghost figure, just like your classic Casper the Friendly Ghost. Except it has little hands and little feet and eyes, and it's just twisting and floating up out of that crack leading to the other world. Just a few shots of some of the people that have backpacked into the various sites there to take a look. Okay, the ranger sites. This one we call the Dancing Dog. It was found by Glenn Rank. There was an earlier photograph that showed Glenn, and he was with the ranger Todd Seliga, who's now out at Tui, and he's been there now for many years. And he's sort of the new John Riffy. And they were doing an extended hike, about a 10-day hike, beyond Whitmore Wash in the western Grand Canyon, and they came upon several panels out there, including this one of the dogs standing on its rear legs. And this panel, the figures are fairly small. This is about 6 inches high. Unlike farther to the east, those main panels, like at Shaman's Gallery, the largest figure there is maybe 6 feet tall. But these are very small compared to those others. And very far west, as far as I know, nothing has been found farther west than this panel. Here's a couple of other sites that depict dogs. And I've seen dogs depicted in probably 4, maybe 5 of these panels. And they're always kind of naturalistic poses, they're not these spooky, haunted images as you see. The one at the top is in that let's play posture. Where dogs kind of bow down and as a sign that they want to play. And the one on the right is a rock art panel named after this. They call it Atlas Shrugged. So it could be a boy and his dog, or a girl and her dog. But one friend pointed out, he says, well, just read in there what you want to read. He said, okay, the head of that human figure there is identical to what he's holding above his head. That could be another head. May not be a ball. He said, have you ever heard about a ball that size showing up in prehistoric context? So who knows? Yeah, just a cautionary tale of what not to read in. Okay, in the same general area, there's another rock art site there. Quite often these archaic figures, they have heads with cat ears, and some of them whiskers, some of them are very definite cat figures, and they're faced forward. Occasionally, I've seen a couple of smaller mountain lions with the classic tail curving up over its back, the claws and all the features of a mountain lion. These are a little hard to tell what they might represent, but with those cat ears, it's a cat figure. To me, what's interesting is this figure right next to it. It looks like a corn plant. My friends that were with me on this questioned me on it, so I need to point out, okay, you could have the reds could be tassels. You have an ear of corn, you have these alternating leaves. And we don't know what span of time this rock art covers. It's the most closely related to the barrier canyon style found in southeastern Utah and up into central Utah. Some rock art researchers consider the Grand Canyon / polychrome / Esplanade style as being just a variety of a subset of the barrier canyon. But those researchers up in Utah now are coming to believe that the barrier canyon rock art spanned about a 6,000 year period. So the rock art in the Grand Canyon, which could be related to, may have covered a wide range of time. And the Archaic period, especially what they call the terminal Archaic, tended to overlap with the introduction of corn into the Colorado Plateau. They keep pushing those dates back farther and farther in time. So I believe that might represent one of those early corn plants. But being a writer instead of an archaeologist, I could make wild speculations like that and not get into too much trouble. What was interesting in this site too, there was a knob of sandstone right behind it, and there was monkey steps, those hand and footholds, carved right into the knob of sandstone. It looks something like this. The one in the picture is where we camped. It's a different one. But the one that had the hand and footholds and led up onto the very top, there were two potholes that probably would have held 30, 35 gallons of water in an area where there was no other visible sign of water. So at certain times of year, or after storms, people that knew that area would have been able to come in there and possibly depend on it. What's also intriguing about this area archaeologically, it's right next to a very large sinkhole. The sinkhole drops in about 50 feet. It's very circular, and it's about 200 to 300 yards in diameter. And I haven't seen any others right in this area. Inside that confined area, we counted, just in a very quick count, 17 roasters, the roasting pits. And they used to call them agave roasting pits, but they're probably used for a variety of different plants. And there's different styles. Most of the roasters there were your classic large mounds of fire-cracked rock and signs of calcinated soil. And there were also some smaller ones too, slab-lined, that may have been used for different purposes. But what's curious about it, you had all of those roasters right in the same place. And look up at that picture of our campus, pretty close to it. There's not a tree in sight. You had to have a lot of wood to roast agave. To roast a heart of agave. I went out with some Apache women, Mescalero women one time, gathering agave over in Guadalupe, just outside of Guadalupe National Park in Texas. And their agave, their mezcal ceremony lasted 5 days, and the roasting took 3 to 5 days. So you need a lot of firewood to heat up those rocks, keep those roasters operating. Where they got the wood, it could have been so far back in time that the tree line has shifted, and they may have had a lower tree line, which is, I suspect, what happened. But why the concentration in that one spot, I still don't know. That's for the next generation of archaeology-minded people to take on. Okay, these are a couple of outliers. They don't fit the normal pattern for the Grand Canyon polychrome style. The one on the left there, again, it's found on the north side of the river, but very far east of all the other sites. This one occurs on the east side. It's outside of the Grand Canyon. It's outside of the national park. It's on the east side of the East Kaibab monocline, the Kaibab Plateau. And it's in the Coconino Formation. It's not in the Supai like almost all of the others. But the style is very reminiscent of that archaic style, long-bodied styles. Mary Allen thought it was a transition between the Grand Canyon and then the Barrier Canyon styles farther north. But there's enough variety in these various styles that it could fit into either one. The one on the right, though, is found as the only known site, the only one I know, that fits this style of rock art found on the south side of the river in the Grand Canyon. And this is right in the main canyon corridor, the main part of the Grand Canyon. And I never knew anything about it until I ran into this desert rat, a guy named Morris Wolf, lived in Hanksville, and he was a rock art enthusiast, and we'd gotten word that there's a new Barrier Canyon spectacular panel that had been found up in the San Rafael swell. It was supposedly only discovered 3 months before. So, it was a top, highly held secret. So we camped out right at the trailhead where we're going to hike in. And as we're setting up camp, Morris Wolf and a friend of his comes out. And they just been to the same site. And Morris is so enthusiastic, he just starts talking a mile a minute about rock art. And then when he heard it was from Arizona or Flagstaff, he asked me if I knew where this certain canyon was on the south side. And I said, oh yeah, sure, I know where that is. He said, oh, you're the first person I met knows where it is. He says, well, a couple of years ago I was in there, I ran out of water, and I was wandering around half delirious, and I spotted across a ravine what looked like Barrier Canyon rock art. Now, he's one of the experts in that style of rock art, so I have to give some weight to his observations, even though he was half dead. So he doesn't carry GPS and didn't have a map, and so he asked me if I'd be willing to go in there and try to find it. I said, if you could send me a location, mark on a map, at least roughly where you found it, I'd go in there. So a year later, I get in the mail this gas station road map. It's at that scale. It has a little dot marked in there and a few little scrawls of where it might be. I hiked in. I spent 4 hours, looking. I found interesting things, but not no sign of the lost rock art panel. So I told Morris, I said, no, I need better information. So about a year later, he hiked back in there with a friend of his, and they relocated the panel. And so they took some photos this time, and then he sent me some more specific. Oh, it was a compass direction off of the South Kaibab Trail, and turns out they didn't compensate for magnetic declination. Anyway, it turns out I went in there with an old friend of mine, Steve Martin, who was the superintendent of the park at the time. And we spent 4 hours again just searching everywhere, and finally came upon it because Steve took one of the photographs and was able to match up the skyline, and we got located the lost panel. And Morris did a little sketch of what the rock art, how it looked to him. Okay, I wanted to bring in too, as I've been talking about, only about the rock art, but the earliest indications of the archaic in the Grand Canyon were these split twig figurines. And they've been known since the first one that was reported, and it was in 1933. And these CCC boys were over in the Clear Creek drainage to the east of Phantom Ranch. And this guy found some of these split twigs. They're made out of, most of them out of red willow. They split a green limb lengthwise, and they wrap it upon itself to give it the shape of a bighorn sheep. And there's been about 400 of these that have been found, and almost all of them occur in the red wall formation and in real caves, in the entrances of caves. You know, that twilight, entry area. They don't go back into the dark zone of the cave. And several of them, 6 I guess, have had what appear to be spears that impale the side of the animal. And again, another half dozen have had dung pellets from either a bighorn sheep or the ancient Harrington mountain goat, which has been extinct since the Pleistocene. But there are some of the skulls and then the dung are found in these caves. So the hunters probably left these as part of a hunting ritual as effigies to show respect for the animal, or to, since they took the life of the animal, this may have been a way that they could ensure that the spirit of the animal would then be reborn and come back to once again give itself to the hunter. The rock art at the top there, it's a very small little figure, and it may represent split twig figurine. It's only about 3.5 inches long, but again, it's hard to say that, just be a guess. The areas of the rock art are farther west. Split twig figurines are found in the main central part of the canyon, and then to the east. I start running a little long on time here, but let me just tell you one story that Gary Stiles told me about finding a cave with these split twig figurines in place. Probably the first one to come upon this cave, because it takes a climb to get to the entrance with some pretty good exposure. He was a park ranger at the Grand Canyon, seasonal ranger back in the early 1970s. But he was an avid backpacker. He hiked a fair amount with Harvey Butcher, you know, the legendary canyon hiker. But he also was a caver. So his days off, he'd either do these hard pushes with Harvey or some other remote part of the canyon, or he'd go caving. And there's a cave that he wanted to explore because he thought they could link up. It was in a very narrow promontory stuck out from the south rim. And there's a good cave entrance on one side, and then the drainage on the farther western side also had an entrance. So I thought, oh, there might be a connection. So he went back in there with his friend, and they explored the cave. And on that trip, they weren't able to make the connection. They later were. But it took a lot of work, by the time they got back out to the entrance chamber, it was already dark, and they had on their caving helmets. In those days, they used the carbide lamps, which has an open flame. It's what the lamps that miners used up until 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So they were tired, so they took a break there at the entrance. Sat down, put their helmets on the ground next to them, with their lights still on. And Gary said he looked up and he couldn't believe it. On the cave wall were these shadows of life-size bighorn sheep. And he looked down, they started looking down what was causing this. And they found, landing against rocks, propped upright, eight of these split twig figurines. And just by chance, that caving light cast those shadows on the wall. And he said he thinks they may have been used that way back in archaic times, you know. They may have been used maybe as some part of some initiation ritual, yeah, who knows how they use them, but the shadow effects may have been also part of the reason why they made these effigies, these figurines that resemble the animals that they relied on for their lives. Okay, to wrap up here, I thought I'd put a human face on the archaic from this one panel. You can see the original rock art, how faded that is, how weathered that is, and it's almost like a faded memory. It gives us just sort of a glimpse of what the people might have looked like. Down below in one of her reports, Mary Allen sketched what she saw in the rock art. And then another friend of ours, a former river guide, Sid Martin, she also made her career in the Park Service and was in charge of Indian affairs for the Western Department of Interior until she retired. She's also an artist, and she did a sketch of the faces. And sometimes the artist's eye can bring out details that the camera misses. And it gives you a little idea, a closer idea of how they used either facial tattooing or paint and head. They could be earrings on the sides, or it could be just a hair tied in, what would you call that? Bobs?
A braid.
Braids, maybe, on the side. Anyway, they probably wouldn't be braided, but wrapped up, sort of like the hair knots in the back, you know. And whether male or female, it's hard to say. Could be either, I suppose. And to close it up here, I'll just give this one more image done by Bill Ott of the Shaman's Gallery. Okay, we're ran a little longer than I thought, but if anybody needs to leave, feel free. But if you want to ask questions, I'll answer what I can.
How large is that panel?
Okay, that panel goes for about 40 feet along a ledge that's perched about 30 feet above the stream bed. And the largest of the figures there is about 6 feet tall. Yeah, I should have had a better shot with it.
And it's not exposed, it's somehow back in?
Yeah, it's back in deep enough to stay in the shade. So these are pictographs, and so they've managed to stay intact there for 3,000 years,
Has everything been saved from Bill Ott's computer? Everything?
The question was, has everything been saved from Bill Ott's computer? His friend has done a backup, and I've done a backup. So his studies, his work. I keep thinking that he did such great work there that towards the end, you make a nice showing at a museum or a gallery or something, just to honor his memory.
So what formation, was there a formation that they liked to draw on?
Yeah, this rock formation here is in the Supai Formation, which is a layer of the Grand Canyon. The upper end of that is called the Esplanade Member, and that's where you find most of the rock art. Yeah.
What do you think the image on the far right is for? Is depicting?
Okay, there's a question about what I think the image on the far right is. We can sit here and speculate all day long. No, it's very, very hard. Okay, these figures here, are they human? Do they depict shaman in a state of trance? Are they supernatural beings? Are they deities of these archaic peoples? They might be ancestral spirits. So, some of them look like larval forms. It's almost like a larva. So they may represent a metamorphosis from one state of being to another. Others look like they might be burial wraps. They may have wrapped up these individuals well, it wouldn't have been cloth then, but in skins and other belts that they had. Do you have any idea yourself?
That looked like a large drum from Africa. A large drum from Africa?
A large drum from Africa.
That don't sound right.
Yes.
Well, when you befriend elders, do you feel like they would ever tell you what they know?
Okay, there's a question about contemporary elders, Indians. This area here is used historically by the Paiute, but they most likely came into the area about 500 or 600 years ago. So there's no direct connection with the much earlier Archaic peoples. Matter of fact, there was a physical anthropologist at the Smithsonian, Dennis Stanford, that in the early days of his career did a study of all the skeletal remains in the Great Basin, comparing Archaic remains to the prehistoric Fremont and then to the historic Paiute. He found no link between his Archaic, the early Archaic, and the later historic and prehistoric peoples. But when I talk to, you have to always be careful who you talk to, because often information about traditions, if it has to do with religious matters, it's esoteric, and they're not going to tell you. They'll guard that information with their lives. But there's lots of information that's not esoteric, and they can talk about, but you have to find the right person. You often have to find someone who's authorized to talk about these things, who's been initiated. And it's a lifelong process. You go through stages of initiation, stages of acquiring knowledge. One thing I learned when I started working closely with traditional Hopi is that they do not value curiosity. To them, that's a childish trait, and they'll tolerate it in Bahanas, Anglos, but they acquire knowledge through a lifelong dedication to a ceremonial society, where you have to spend, and when they're first initiated, they're given almost a child's version of the story. And then as they spend more time in the kivas, conducting the ceremonies, fasting, praying, dedicating their lives to helping their people, they're then more privileged to acquire more and more knowledge. And the knowledge becomes more sophisticated as the years go on. And so if you read in the anthropological literature, quite often, especially in the early days, an informant would have been someone who, a true Hopi say, but only heard secondhand. They'd never been initiated into that ceremonial society. So maybe giving them just sort of his take from his second cousin who might have told him when he was drunk one day and on a spree in town, so you have to be real careful and find someone, and often it takes a lifetime of building up a relationship. And traditional leaders I've talked to about these sites and shown pictures to them. Traditional leaders at First Mesa have told me they feel no connection to these. Even though as I gave you that Hopi story, and that story of that deep bond with the deer and the hunters, still they don't. This whole style to them is just something. I was going to say alien. Probably not as alien as it is to us, but they just don't feel like it comes from their tradition. Any more questions?